This is Chapter 11 of The Boy's Life of Mark Twain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. The Boy's Life of Mark Twain by Albert Bigelow Paine. Chapter 11, The Long Way to the Amazon. Sam decided on Cincinnati as his base. From there he could go either to New York or New Orleans to catch the Amazon boat. He paid a visit to St. Louis, where his mother made him renew his promise as to drink and cards. Then he was seized with a literary idea, and returned to Keokuk, where he proposed to a thriving weekly paper, the Saturday Post, to send letters of travel, which might even be made into a book later on. George Reese, owner of the Post, agreed to pay $5 each for the letters, which speaks well for his faith in Samuel Clemens' talent. $5 being good pay for that time and place, more than the letters were worth, judged by present standards. The first was dated Cincinnati, November 14, 1856, and was certainly not promising literature. It was written in the ridiculous dialect which was once thought to be the dress of humor, and while here and there is a comic flash, there is in it little promise of the future Mark Twain. One extract is enough. When we got to the depot, I went around to get a look at the iron hoss. Thunderation! It wasn't no more like a hoss than a meetin' house. If I was going to describe the animule, I'd say it looked like, well, it looked like, blamed if I know what it looked like, snorting fire and brimstone out of his nostrils and puffing out black smoke all round and panting and heaving and swelling and chawing up red-hot coals like they was good. A feller stood in a little house like feeding him all the time, but the more he got, the more he wanted, and the more he blowed and snorted. After a spell the feller ketched him by the tail, and great Jericho, he set up a yell that split the ground for more'n a mile and a half, and the next minute I felt my legs a-wagging, and found myself at t'other end of the string of vehicles. I wasn't skeered, but I had 3 chills and a stroke of palsy in less than 5 minutes, and my face had a curious brownish yaller green bluish color in it which was perfectly unaccountable. "Well," says I, "comment is superfluous." How Samuel Clemens could have written that, and worse, at 21, and a little more than 10 years later have written The Innocents Abroad, is one of the mysteries of literature. The letters were signed Snodgrass, and there are but 2 of them. Snodgrass seems to have found them hard work, for it is said he raised on the price, which fortunately brought the series to a close. Their value today lies in the fact that they are the earliest of Mark Twain's newspaper contributions that have been preserved, the first for which he received a cash return. Sam remained in Cincinnati until April of the following year, 1857, working for Wrightson & Company, general printers, lodging in a cheap boarding-house, saving every possible penny for his great adventure. He had one associate at the boarding-house, a lank, unsmiling Scotchman named Macfarlane, twice young Clemens' age, and a good deal of a mystery. Sam never could find out what Macfarlane did. His hands were hardened by some sort of heavy labor. He left at 6 in the morning and returned in the evening at the same hour. He never mentioned his work, and young Clemens had the delicacy not to inquire. For Macfarlane was no ordinary person. He was a man of deep knowledge, a reader of books, a thinker. He was versed in history and philosophy. He knew the dictionary by heart. He made but 2 statements concerning himself: one, that he had acquired his knowledge from reading, and not at school; the other, that he knew every word in the English dictionary. He was willing to give proof of the last, and Sam Clemens tested him more than once, but found no word that Macfarlane could not define. Macfarlane was not silent. He would discuss readily enough the deeper problems of life, and had many startling theories of his own. Darwin had not yet published his Descent of Man, yet Macfarlane was already advancing ideas similar to those in that book. He went further than Darwin. He had startling ideas of the moral evolution of man, and these he would pour into the ears of his young listener until 10 o'clock, after which, like the English Sumner in Philadelphia, he would grill a herring, and the evening would end. Those were fermenting discourses that young Samuel Clemens listened to that winter in Macfarlane's room, and they did not fail to influence his later thought. It was the high tide of spring, late in April, when the prospective cocoa hunter decided that it was time to set out for the upper Amazon. He had saved money enough to carry him at least as far as New Orleans, where he would take ship, it being farther south and therefore nearer his destination. Furthermore, he could begin with a lazy trip down the Mississippi, which, next to being a pilot, had been one of his most cherished dreams. The Ohio River steamers were less grand than those of the Mississippi, but they had a homelike atmosphere and did not hurry. Samuel Clemens had the spring fever and was willing to take his time. In Life on the Mississippi we read that the author ran away, vowing never to return until he could come home a pilot, shedding glory. But this is the fiction touch. He had always loved the river, and his boyhood dream of piloting had time and again returned, but it was not uppermost when he bade good-bye to McFarlane and stepped aboard the Paul Jones, bound for New Orleans, and thus conferred immortality on that ancient little craft. Now he had really started on his voyage, but it was a voyage that would continue not for a week or a fortnight, but for 4 years, 4 marvelous sunlit years, the glory of which would color all that followed them. End of chapter 11. This is Chapter 12 of The Boy's Life of Mark Twain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. The Boy's Life of Mark Twain by Albert Bigelow Paine, Chapter 12, Renewing an Old Ambition. A reader of Mark Twain's Mississippi book gets the impression that the author was a boy of about 17 when he started to learn the river, and that he was painfully ignorant of the great task ahead. But this, also, is the fiction side of the story. Samuel Clemens was more than 21 when he set out on the Paul Jones, and in a way was familiar with the trade of piloting. Hannibal had turned out many pilots. An older brother of the Bowen boys was already on the river when Sam Clemens was rolling rocks down Holliday's Hill. Often he came home to air his grandeur and hold forth on the wonder of his work. That learning the river was no light task Sam Clemens would know as well as anyone who had not tried it. Nevertheless, as the drowsy little steamer went puffing down into softer, sunnier lands, the old dream, the permanent ambition of boyhood returned, while the call of the far-off Amazon and cocoa drew faint. Horace Bixby, footnote 2, Horace Bixby lived until 1912 and remained at the wheel until within a short time of his death, in his 87th year. The writer of this memoir visited him in 1910 and took down from his dictation the dialogue that follows. End of footnote 2. Horace Bixby, pilot of the Paul Jones, a man of 32, was looking out over the bow at the head of island number 35 when he heard a slow, pleasant voice say, "Good morning." Bixby was a small, clean-cut man. "Good morning, sir," he said, rather briskly, without looking around. He did not much care for visitors in the pilot-house. This one entered and stood a little behind him. "How would you like a young man to learn the river?" came to him in that serene, deliberate speech. The pilot glanced over his shoulder and saw a rather slender, loose-limbed youth with a fair, girlish complexion and a great mass of curly auburn hair. "I wouldn't like it. Cub pilots are more trouble than they're worth. A great deal more trouble than profit." "I am a printer by trade," the easy voice went on. "It doesn't agree with me. I thought I'd go to South America." Bixby kept his eye on the river, but there was interest in his voice when he spoke. "What makes you pull your words that way?" he asked, pulling being the river term for drawling. The young man, now seated comfortably on the visitor's bench, said more slowly than ever, "You'll have to ask my mother. She pulls hers, too." Pilot Bixby laughed. The manner of the reply amused him. His guest was encouraged. "Do you know the Bowen boys?" he asked. "Pilots in the St. Louis and New Orleans trade." "I know 'em well, all 3 of them. William Bowen did his first steering for me. A mighty good boy. I know Sam, too, and Bart. Old schoolmates of mine in Hannibal. Sam and Will, especially, were my chums." Bixby's tone became friendly. "Come over and stand by me," he said. "What is your name?" The applicant told him, and the two stood looking out on the sunlit water. "Do you drink?" "No." "Do you gamble?" "No, sir." "Do you swear?" "Not for amusement, only under pressure." "Do you chew?" "No, sir, never. But I must smoke." "Did you ever do any steering?" "I have steered everything on the river but a steamboat, I guess." "Very well. Take the wheel and see what you can do with a steamboat. Keep her as she is, toward that lower cottonwood snag." Bixby had a sore foot and was glad of a little relief. He sat on the bench where he could keep a careful eye on the course. By and by he said, "There's just one way I would take a young man to learn the river. That is, for money." "What do you charge?" $500, and I to be at no expense whatever." In those days pilots were allowed to carry a learner, or cub, board free. Mr. Bixby meant that he was to be at no expense in port or for incidentals. His terms seemed discouraging. "I haven't got $500 in money," Sam said. "I've got a lot of Tennessee land worth 2 bits an acre. I'll give you 2,000 acres of that." Bixby shook his head. "No," he said, "I don't want any unimproved real estate. I have too much already." Sam reflected. He thought he might be able to borrow $100 from William Moffett, Pamela's husband, without straining his credit. "Well, then," he proposed, "I'll give you $100 cash, and the rest when I earn it." Something about this young man had won Horace Bixby's heart. His slow, pleasant speech, his unhurried, quiet manner at the wheel, his evident simplicity and sincerity, the inner qualities of mind and heart which would make the world love Mark Twain. The terms proposed were accepted. The first payment was to be in cash. The others were to begin when the pupil had learned the river and was earning wages. During the rest of the trip to New Orleans the new pupil was often at the wheel, while Mr. Bixby nursed his sore foot and gave directions. Any literary ambitions that Samuel Clemens still nourished waned rapidly. By the time he had reached New Orleans he had almost forgotten he had ever been a printer. As for the Amazon and cocoa, why, there had been no ship sailing in that direction for years, and it was unlikely that any would ever sail again, a fact that rather amused the would-be adventurer now, since Providence had regulated his affairs in accordance with his oldest and longest-cherished dream. At New Orleans Bixby left the Paul Jones for a fine St. Louis boat, taking his cub with him. This was a sudden and happy change, and Sam was a good deal impressed with his own importance in belonging to so imposing a structure, especially when, after a few days' stay in New Orleans, he stood by Bixby's side in the big glass turret while they backed out of the line of wedged-in boats and headed up the great river. This was glory, but there was sorrow ahead. He had not really begun learning the river. As yet he had only steered under directions. He had known that to learn the river would be hard, but he had never realized quite how hard. Serenely he had undertaken the task of mastering 1,200 miles of the great, changing, shifting river as exactly and as surely by daylight or darkness as one knows the way to his own features. Nobody could realize the full size of that task. Not till afterward. End of chapter 12. This is Chapter 13 of The Boy's Life of Mark Twain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. The Boy's Life of Mark Twain by Albert Bigelow Paine. Chapter 13, Learning the River. In that early day, to be a pilot was to be greater than a king. The Mississippi River pilot was a law unto himself. There was none above him. His direction of the boat was absolute. He could start or lay up when he chose. He could pass a landing regardless of business there, consulting nobody, not even the captain. he could take the boat into what seemed certain destruction, if he had that in mind, and the captain was obliged to stand by helpless and silent, for the law was with the pilot in everything. Furthermore, the pilot was a gentleman. His work was clean and physically light. It ended the instant the boat was tied to the landing, and did not begin again until it was ready to back into the stream. Also, for those days his salary was princely. The Vice President of the United States did not receive more. As for prestige, the Mississippi pilot, perched high in his glass enclosure, fashionably dressed, and commanding all below him, was the most conspicuous and showy, the most observed and envied creature in the world. No wonder Sam Clemens, with his love of the river and his boyish fondness for honors, should aspire to that stately rank. Even at 21 he was still just a boy, as indeed he was till his death, and we may imagine how elated he was, starting up the great river as a real apprentice pilot, who in a year or two would stand at the wheel, as his chief was now standing, a monarch with a splendid income and all the great river packed away in his head. In that last item lay the trouble. In the Mississippi book he tells of it in a way that no one may hope to equal, and if the details are not exact, the truth is there, at least in substance. For a distance above New Orleans, Mr. Bixby had volunteered information about the river, naming the points and crossings, in what seemed a casual way, all through his watch of 4 hours. Their next watch began in the middle of the night, and Mark Twain tells how surprised and disgusted he was to learn that pilots must get up in the night to run their boats, and his amazement to find Mr. Bixby plunging into the blackness ahead as if it had been daylight. Very likely this is mainly fiction, but hardly the following. Presently he turned to me and said, "What's the name of the first point above New Orleans?" I was gratified to be able to answer promptly, and I did. I said I didn't know. "Don't know?" His manner jolted me. I was down at the foot again in a moment, but I had to say just what I had said before. "Well, you're a smart one," said Mr. Bixby. "What's the name of the next point?" Once more I didn't know. "Well, this beats anything. Tell me the name of any point or place I told you." I studied a while and decided that I couldn't. "Look here. What do you start from above 12-Mile Point to cross over?" I don't know." You don't know," mimicking my drawling manner of speech. "What do you know?" Nothing for certain." Bixby was a small, nervous man, hot and quick-firing. He went off now and said a number of severe things. Then, "Look here, what do you suppose I told you the names of those points for?" I tremblingly considered a moment. Then the devil of temptation provoked me to say, "Well, to be entertaining, I thought." This was a red flag to the bull. He raged and stormed so (he was crossing the river at the time) that I judged it made him blind, because he ran over the steering oar of a trading scow. Of course the traders sent up a volley of red-hot profanity. Never was a man so grateful as Mr. Bixby was, because he was brimful, and here were subjects who would talk back. He threw open a window, thrust his head out, and such an eruption followed as I had never heard before. When he closed the window he was empty. Presently he said to me, in the gentlest way, "My boy, you must get a little memorandum book, and every time I tell you a thing, put it down right away. There's only one way to be a pilot, and that is to get this entire river by heart. You have to know it just like ABC." This little memorandum book, which Sam Clemens bought, probably at the next daylight landing, still exists, the same that he says fairly bristled with the names of towns, points, bars, islands, bends, reaches, etc. But it made his heart ache to think he had only half the river set down, for as the watches were 4 hours off and 4 hours on, there were the long gaps where he had slept. It is not easy to make out the penciled notes today. The small, neat writing is faded, and many of them are in an abbreviation made only for himself. It is hard even to find these examples to quote. Merryweather's Bend, 1/4 less 3, footnote 3, depth of water, 1/4 less than 3 fathoms. End of footnote 3. Run shape of upper bar and go into the low place in the willows about 200 feet lower down than last year. Outside of Montezuma, 6 or 8 feet more water. Shape bar till high timber on towhead gets nearly even with low willows. Then hold a little open on right of low willows, run 'em close if you want to, but come out 200 yards when you get nearly to head of towhead. The average mind would not hold a single one of these notes 10 seconds, yet by the time he reached St. Louis he had set down pages that today make one's head weary even to contemplate. And those long 4-hour gaps where he had been asleep, they are still there, and now, after nearly 60 years, the old heartache is still in them. He must have bought a new book for the next trip and laid this one away. To the new cub it seemed a long way to St. Louis that first trip, but in the end it was rather grand to come steaming up to the big, busy city, with its thronging waterfront flanked with a solid mile of steamboats, and to nose one's way to a place in that stately line. At St. Louis, Sam borrowed from his brother-in-law the $100 he had agreed to pay, and so closed his contract with Bixby. A few days later his chief was engaged to go on a very grand boat indeed, a sumptuous temple, he tells us, all brass and inlay, with a pilot-house so far above the water that he seemed perched on a mountain. This part of learning the river was worth while, and when he found that the regiment of natty servants respectfully sirred him, his happiness was complete. But he was in the depth again presently, for when they started down the river and he began to take account of his knowledge, he found that he had none. Everything had changed. That is, he was seeing it all from the other direction. What with the 4-hour gaps and this transformation, he was lost completely. How could the easy-going, dreamy, unpractical man whom the world knew as Mark Twain ever have persisted against discouragement like that to acquire the vast, the absolute, limitless store of information necessary to Mississippi piloting? The answer is that he loved the river, the picturesqueness and poetry of a steamboat, the ease and glory of a pilot's life. And then, in spite of his own later claims to the contrary, Samuel Clemens, boy and man, in the work suited to his tastes and gifts, was the most industrious of persons. Work of the other sort he avoided, overlooked, refused to recognize, but never any labor for which he was qualified by his talents or training. Piloting suited him exactly, and he proved an apt pupil. Horace Bixby said to the writer of this memoir, "Sam was always good-natured, and he had a natural taste for the river. He had a fine memory, and never forgot what I told him." Yet there must have been hard places all along, for to learn every crook and turn and stump and snag and bluff and bar and sounding of that 1,200 miles of mighty, shifting water was a gigantic task. Mark Twain tells us how, when he was getting along pretty well, his chief one day turned on him suddenly with this settler: "What is the shape of Walnut Bend?" He might as well have asked me my grandmother's opinion of protoplasm. I replied respectfully and said I didn't know it had any particular shape. My gunpowdery chief went off with a bang, of course, and then went on loading and firing until he was out of adjectives. I waited. By and by he said, "My boy, you've got to know the shape of the river perfectly. It is all that is left to steer by on a very dark night. Everything else is blotted out and gone. But mind you, It hasn't got the same shape in the night that it has in the daytime. How on earth am I going to learn it, then? How do you follow a hall at home in the dark? Because you know the shape of it. You can't see it. Do you mean to say that I've got to know all the million trifling variations of shape in the banks of this interminable river as well as I know the shape of the front hall at home? On my honor, you've got to know them better than any man ever did know the shapes of the halls in his own house. I wish I was dead. But the reader must turn to Chapter 8 of Life on the Mississippi and read or reread the pages which follow this extract. Nothing can better convey the difficulties of piloting. That Samuel Clemens had the courage to continue is the best proof, not only of his great love of the river, but of that splendid gift of resolution that one rarely fails to find in men of the foremost rank. End of Chapter 13. This is Chapter 14 of The Boy's Life of Mark Twain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. The Boy's Life of Mark Twain by Albert Bigelow Paine, Chapter 14, River Days. Piloting was only part of Sam Clemens' education on the Mississippi. He learned as much of the reefs and shallows of human nature as of the river-bed. In one place he writes, "In that brief, sharp schooling I got personally and familiarly acquainted with all the different types of human nature that are to be found in fiction, biography, or history. All the different types, but most of them in the rough. That Samuel Clemens kept the promise made to his mother as to drink and cards during those apprentice days is well worth remembering. Horace Bixby, answering a call for pilots from the Missouri River, consigned his pupil, as was customary, ton of the pilots of the John J. Roe, a freight boat owned and conducted by some retired farmers, and in its hospitality reminding Sam of his Uncle John Quarles's farm. The Roe was a very deliberate boat. It was said that she could beat an island to St. Louis, but never quite overtake the current going downstream. Sam loved the Roe. She was not licensed to carry passengers, but she always had a family party of the owner's relations aboard, and there was a big deck for dancing and a piano in the cabin. The young pilot could play the chords and sing in his own fashion, about a grasshopper that sat on the sweet potato vine, and about an old horse whose name was Methusalem took him down and sold him in Jerusalem a long time ago. The Roe was a heavenly place, but Sam's stay there did not last. Bixby came down from the Missouri, and perhaps thought he was doing a fine thing for his pupil by transferring him to a pilot named Brown, then on a large passenger steamer, the Pennsylvania. The Pennsylvania was new and one of the finest boats on the river. Sam Clemens by this time was accounted a good steersman, so it seemed fortunate and a good arrangement for all parties. But Brown was a tyrant. He was illiterate and coarse, and took a dislike to Sam from the start. His first greeting was a question, harmless enough in form but offensive in manner. "Are you Horace Bigsby's cub?" Bixby being usually pronounced Bigsby in river parlance. Sam answered politely enough that he was, and Brown proceeded to comment on the style of his clothes and other personal matters. He had made an effort to please Brown, but it was no use. Brown was never satisfied. At a moment when Sam was steering, Brown, sitting on the bench, would shout, "Here! Where are you going now? Pull her down! Pull her down! Don't you hear me? Blamed mudcat!" The young pilot soon learned to detest his chief, and presently was putting in a good deal of his time inventing punishments for him. I could imagine myself killing Brown. There was no law against that, and that was the thing I always used to do the moment I was abed. Instead of going over the river in my mind, as was my duty, I threw business aside for pleasure, and killed Brown. He gave up trying to please Brown, and was even willing to stir him up upon occasion. One day when the cub was at the wheel his chief noticed that the course seemed peculiar. "Here! Where you heading for now?" he yelled. "What in the nation you steering at anyway, blame numbskull?" "Why," said Sam in his calm, slow way, "I didn't see much else I could steer for, so I was heading for that white heifer on the bank." "Get away from that wheel, and get on this pilot house!" yelled Brown. "You ain't fitting to become no pilot." An order that Sam found welcome enough. The other pilot, George Ealer, was a lovable soul who played the flute and chess during his off watch, and read aloud to Sam from Goldsmith and Shakespeare. To be with George Ealer was to forget the persecutions of Brown. Young Clemens had been on the river nearly a year at this time, and though he had learned a good deal and was really a fine steersman, he received no wages. He had no board to pay, but there were things he must buy, and his money supply had become limited. Each trip of the Pennsylvania she remained about 2 days and nights in New Orleans, during which time the young man was free. He found he could earn $2.50 to $3 a night watching freight on the levee, and as this opportunity came around about once a month, the amount was useful. Nor was this the only return. Many years afterward he said, "It was a desolate experience, watching there in the dark among those piles of freight, not a sound, not a living creature astir, but it was not a profitless one. I used to have inspirations as I sat there alone those nights. I used to imagine all sorts of situations and possibilities. These things got into my books by and by, and furnished me with many a chapter. I can trace the effects of those nights through most of my books in one way and another." Piloting, even with Brown, had its pleasant side. In St. Louis, young Clemens stopped with his sister, and often friends were there from Hannibal. At both ends of the line he visited friendly boats, especially the Roe, where a grand welcome was always waiting. Once among the guests of that boat a young girl named Laura so attracted him that he forgot time and space until one of the Roe pilots, Zeb Leavenworth, came flying aft shouting, "The Pennsylvania is backing out!" A hasty good-bye, a wild flight across the decks of several boats, and a leap across several feet of open water closed the episode. He wrote to Laura, but there was no reply. He never saw her again, never heard from her for nearly 50 years, when both were widowed and old. She had not received his letter. Occasionally there were stirring adventures aboard the Pennsylvania. In a letter written in March, 1858, the young pilot tells of an exciting night search in the running ice for Hat Island soundings. "Brown, the pilot, stood in the bow with an oar to keep her head out, and I took the tiller. We would start the men, and all would go well until the yawl would bring us on a heavy cake of ice, and then the men would drop like so many tenpins, while Brown assumed the horizontal in the bottom of the boat. After an hour's hard work we got back, with ice half an inch thick on the oars. The next day was colder still. I was out in the yawl twice, and then we got through, but the infernal steamboat came near running over us. The Maria Denning was aground at the head of the island. They hailed us, we ran alongside, and they hoisted us in and thawed us out. We had been out in the yawl from 4 in the morning until half-past 9 without being near a fire. There was a thick coating of ice over men and yawl, ropes, and everything, and we looked like rock candy statuary. He was at the right age to enjoy such adventures, and to feel a pride in them. In the same letter he tells how he found on the Pennsylvania a small clerkship for his brother Henry, who was now nearly 20. A handsome, gentle boy of whom Sam was lavishly fond and proud. The young pilot was eager to have Henry with him, to see him started in life. How little he dreamed what sorrow would come of his well-meant efforts in the lad's behalf. Yet he always believed later that he had a warning, for one night at the end of May in St. Louis he had a vivid dream which time would presently fulfill. An incident now occurred on the Pennsylvania that closed Samuel Clemens' career on that boat. It was the down trip, and the boat was in Eagle Bend when Henry Clemens appeared on the hurricane deck with an announcement from the captain of a landing a little lower down. Brown, who would never own that he was rather deaf, probably misunderstood the order. They were passing the landing when the captain appeared on the deck. "Didn't Henry tell you to land here?" he called to Brown. "No, sir." Captain Klinefelter turned to Sam. "Didn't you hear him?" "Yes, sir." Brown said, "Shut your mouth! You never heard anything of the kind." Henry appeared, not suspecting any trouble. Brown said fiercely, "Here, why did you tell me we got to land at that plantation?" "I did tell you, Mr. Brown," Henry said politely. "It's a lie." Sam Clemens could stand Brown's abuse of himself, but not of Henry. He said, "You lie yourself. He did tell you." For a cub pilot to defy his chief was unheard of. Brown was dazed. Then he shouted, "I'll attend to your case in half a minute," and to Henry, "Get out of here." Henry had started when Brown seized him by the collar and struck him in the face. An instant later Sam was upon Brown with a heavy stool and stretched him on the floor. Then all the repressed fury of months broke loose, and, leaping upon Brown and holding him down with his knees, Samuel Clemens pounded the tyrant with his fists till his strength gave out. He let Brown go then, and the latter, with pilot instinct, sprang to the wheel, for the boat was drifting. Seeing she was safe, he seized a spy-glass as a weapon and ordered his chastiser out of the pilot-house. But Sam lingered. He had become very calm, and he openly corrected Brown's English. "Don't give me none of your airs," yelled Brown. "I ain't going to stand nothing more from you." "You should say, 'Don't give me any of your airs,'" Sam said sweetly, "and the last half of your sentence almost defies correction." A group of passengers and white-aproned servants assembled on the deck forward applauded the victor. Sam went down to find Captain Klinefelter. He expected to be put in irons, for it was thought to be mutiny to strike a pilot. The captain took Sam into his private room and made some inquiries. Mark Twain in the Mississippi book remembers them as follows: "Did you strike him first?" Captain Klinefelter asked. "Yes, sir." "What with?" "A stool, sir." "Hard?" "Middling, sir." "Did it knock him down?" He fell, sir." "Did you follow it up? Did you do anything further?" "Yes, sir." "What did you do?" "Pounded him, sir." "Pounded him?" "Yes, sir." "Did you pound him much, that is, severely?" "One might call it that, sir, maybe." "I am mighty glad of it. Harkye, never mention that I said that. You have been guilty of a great crime, and don't ever be guilty of it again on this boat. But lay for him ashore. Give him a good sound thrashing, do you hear? I'll pay the expenses." In a letter which Samuel Clemens wrote to Orion's wife immediately after this incident, he gives the details of the encounter with Brown and speaks of Captain Klinefelter's approval. Footnote 4. In the Mississippi book the author says that Brown was about to strike Henry with a lump of coal, but in the letter above mentioned the details are as here given. End of footnote 4. Brown declared he would leave the boat at New Orleans if Sam Clemens remained on it, and the captain told him to go, offering to let Sam himself run the daylight watches back to St. Louis, thus showing his faith in the young steersman. The cub, however, had less confidence, and advised that Brown be kept for the up trip, saying he would follow by the next boat. It was a decision that probably saved his life. That night, watching on the levee, Henry joined him, when his own duties were finished and the brothers made the round together. It may have been some memory of his dream that made Samuel Clemens say, "Henry, in case of accident, whatever you do, don't lose your head. The passengers will do that. Rush for the hurricane deck and to the lifeboat, and obey the mate's orders. When the boat is launched, help the women and children into it. Don't get in yourself. The river is only a mile wide. You can swim ashore easily enough." It was good, manly advice, but a long grief lay behind it. End of chapter 14. This is Chapter 15 of The Boy's Life of Mark Twain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. The Boy's Life of Mark Twain, by Albert Bigelow Paine, Chapter 15, The Wreck of the Pennsylvania. The A.T. Lacey that brought Samuel Clemens up the river was 2 days behind the Pennsylvania. At Greenville, Mississippi, a voice from the landing shouted, "The Pennsylvania is blown up just below Memphis at Ship Island. 150 lives lost." It proved a true report. At 6 o'clock that warm mid-June morning, while loading wood, 60 miles below Memphis, 4 out of 8 of the Pennsylvania's boilers had suddenly exploded, with fearful results. Henrylemons had been one of the victims. He had started to swim for the shore only a few hundred yards away, but had turned back to assist in the rescue of others. What followed could not be clearly learned. He was terribly injured, and died on the 4th night after the catastrophe. His brother was with him by that time, and believed he recognized the exact fulfillment of his dream. The young pilot's grief was very great. In a letter home he spoke of the dying boy as "my darling, my pride, my glory, my all." His heavy sorrow, and the fact that with unsparing self-blame he held himself in a measure responsible for his brother's tragic death, saddened his early life. His early gaiety came back, but his face had taken on the serious, pathetic look which from that time it always wore in repose. Less than 23, he had suddenly the look of 30, and while Samuel Clemens in spirit, temperament, and features never would become really old, neither would he ever look really young again. He returned to the river as steersman for George Ealer, whom he loved, and in September of that year obtained a full license as Mississippi River pilot from St. Louis to New Orleans. In 18 months he had packed away in his head all those wearisome details and acquired that confidence that made him one of the elect. He knew every snag and bank and dead tree and depth in all those endless miles of shifting current, every cut-off and crossing. He could read the surface of the water by day, he could smell danger in the dark. To the writer of these chapters, Horace Bixby said, "In a year and a half from the time he came to the river, Sam was not only a pilot, but a good one. Sam was a fine pilot. And in a day when piloting on the Mississippi required a great deal more brains and skill and application than it does now. There were no signal lights along the shore in those days, and no searchlights on the vessels. Everything was blind, and on a dark, misty night, in a river full of snags and shifting sandbars and changing shores, a pilot's judgment had to be founded on absolute certainty." Bixby had returned from the Missouri by the time his pupil's license was issued, and promptly took him as full partner on the Crescent City, and later on a fine new boat, the New Falls City. Still later they appear to have been together on a very large boat, the City of Memphis, and again on the Alonzo Child. End of chapter 15. This is Chapter 16 of The Boy's Life of Mark Twain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. The Boy's Life of Mark Twain, by Albert Bigelow Paine. Chapter 16, The Pilot. For Samuel Clemens these were happy days, the happiest in some respects he would ever know. He had plenty of money now. He could help his mother with a liberal hand, and could put away fully $100 a month for himself. He had few cares, and he loved the ease and romance and independence of his work as he would never quite love anything again. His popularity on the river was very great. His humorous stories and quaint speech made a crowd collect wherever he appeared. There were pilot association rooms in St. Louis and New Orleans, and his appearance at one of these places was a signal for the members to gather. A friend of those days writes, "He was much given to spinning yarns so funny that his hearers were convulsed, and yet all the time his own face was perfectly sober. Occasionally some of his droll yarns got into the papers. He may have written them himself. Another old riverman remembers how one day at the association they were talking of presence of mind in an accident, when Pilot Clemens said, "Boys, I had great presence of mind once. It was at a fire. An old man leaned out of a 4-story building calling for help. Everybody in the crowd below looked up, but nobody did anything. The ladders weren't long enough. Nobody had any presence of mind, nobody but me. I came to the rescue. I yelled for a rope. When it came, I threw the old man the end of it. He caught it, and I told him to tie it around his waist. He did so, and I pulled him down." This was a story that found its way into print, probably his own contribution. "Sam was always scribbling when not at the wheel," said Bixby, "but the best thing he ever did was the burlesque of old Isaiah Sellers. He didn't write it for print, but only for his own amusement and to show to a few of the boys. Bart Bowen, who was with him on the Edward J. Gay at the time, got hold of it and gave it to one of the New Orleans papers." The burlesque on Captain Sellers would be of little importance if it were not for its association with the origin, or at least with the originator, of what is probably the best known of literary names, the name Mark Twain. This strong, happy title, a river term indicating a depth of 2 fathoms on the sounding line, was first used by the old pilot, Isaiah Sellers, who was a sort of oldest inhabitant of the river, with a passion for airing his ancient knowledge before the younger men. Sellers used to send paragraphs to the papers, quaint and rather egotistical in tone, usually beginning, "My opinion for the citizens of New Orleans," etc., prophesying river conditions and recalling memories as far back as 1811. These he generally signed Mark Twain. Naturally, the younger pilots amused themselves by imitating Sellers, and when Sam Clemens wrote a broad burlesque of the old man's contributions, relating a perfectly impossible trip, supposed to have been made in 1763 with a Chinese captain and a Choctaw crew, it was regarded as a masterpiece of wit. It appeared in the True Delta in May, 1859, and broke Captain Sellers' literary heart. He never wrote another paragraph. Clemens always regretted the whole matter deeply, and his own revival of the name afterward was a sort of tribute to the old man he had thoughtlessly and unintentionally wounded. Old pilots of that day remembered Samuel Clemens as a slender, fine-looking man, well-dressed, even dandified, generally wearing blue serge with fancy shirts, white duck trousers, and patent leather shoes. A pilot could do that, for his surroundings were speckless. The pilots regarded him as a great reader, a student of history, travels, and the sciences. In the association rooms they often saw him poring over serious books. He began the study of French one day in New Orleans, when he had passed a school of languages where French, German, and Italian were taught, one in each of 3 rooms. The price was $25 for one language, or 3 for 50. The student was provided with a set of conversation cards for each, and was supposed to walk from one apartment to another, changing his nationality at each threshold. The young pilot, with his usual enthusiasm, invested in all 3 languages, but after a few round trips decided that French would do. He did not return to the school, but kept the cards and added textbooks. He studied faithfully when off watch and in port, and his old river notebook, still preserved, contains a number of advanced exercises neatly written out. Still more interesting are the river notes themselves. They are not the timid, hesitating memoranda of the little book which, by Bixby's advice, he bought for his first trip. They are quick, vigorous records that show confidence and knowledge. Under the head of Second High Water Trip, January 1861, Alonzo Child, The notes tell the story of a rising river with overflowing banks, blind passages and cut-offs, a new river, in fact, that must be judged by a perfect knowledge of the old, guessed, but guessed right. Good deal of water all over Cole's Creek chute, 12 or 15 feet bank. Could have gone up above General Taylor's, too much drift. Night, didn't run either 77 or 76 towheads, 8 foot, bank on main shore, Ozark chute. To the reader today it means little enough, but one may imagine, perhaps, a mile-wide sweep of boiling water full of drift, shifting currents with newly forming bars, and a lone figure in the dark pilot-house, peering into the night for blind and disappearing landmarks. But such nights were not all there was of piloting. There were glorious nights when the stars were blazing out, and the moon was on the water, and the young pilot could follow a clear channel and dream long dreams. He was very serious at such times. He reviewed the world's history he had read, he speculated on the future, he considered philosophies, he lost himself in a study of the stars. Mark Twain's love of astronomy, which never waned until his last day, began with those lonely river watches. Once a great comet blazed in the sky, a wonderful sheaf of light, and glorified his long hours at the wheel. Samuel Clemens was now 25, full of health and strong in his courage. In the old notebook there remains a well-worn clipping, the words of some unknown writer, which he may have kept as a sort of creed. How to take life. Take it just as though it was, as it is, an earnest, vital, and important affair. Take it as though you were born to the task of performing a merry part in it, as though the world had awaited for your coming. Take it as though it was a grand opportunity to do and achieve, to carry forward great and good schemes, to help and cheer a suffering, weary, it may be heartbroken, brother. Now and then a man stands aside from the crowd, labors earnestly, steadfastly, confidently, and straightway becomes famous for wisdom, intellect, skill, greatness of some sort. The world wonders, admires, idolizes, and it only illustrates what others may do if they take hold of life with a purpose. The miracle, or the power that elevates the few, is to be found in their industry, application, and perseverance under the promptings of a brave, determined spirit. Bixby and Clemens were together that winter on The Child, and were the closest friends. Once the young pilot invited his mother to make the trip to New Orleans, and the river journey and a long drive about the beautiful southern city filled Jane Clemens with wonder and delight. She no longer had any doubts of Sam. He had long since become the head of the family. She felt called upon to lecture him now and then, but down in her heart she believed that he could really do no wrong. They joked each other unmercifully, and her wit, never at a loss, was quite as keen as his. End of chapter 16. This is The Boy's Life of Mark Twain, chapter 17. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. The Boy's Life of Mark Twain, by Albert Bigelow Paine. Chapter 17. The End of Piloting. When one remembers how much Samuel Clemens loved the river, and how perfectly he seemed suited to the ease and romance of the pilot life, one is almost tempted to regret that it should so soon have come to an end. Those trips of early '61, which the old notebook records, were the last he would ever make. The golden days of Mississippi steamboating were growing few. Nobody, however, seemed to suspect it. Even a celebrated fortune-teller in New Orleans, whom the young pilot one day consulted as to his future, did not mention the great upheaval then close at hand. She told him quite remarkable things, and gave him some excellent advice, but though this was February 1861, she failed to make any mention of the Civil War. Yet a month later Abraham Lincoln was inaugurated, and trouble was in the air. Then in April Fort Sumter was fired upon, and the war had come. It was a feverish time among the pilots. Some were for the Union, others would go with the Confederacy. Horace Bixby stood for the North, and in time was chief of the Union River service. A pilot named Montgomery, Clemens had once steered for him, went with the South, and by commanded the Confederate Mississippi fleet. In the beginning a good many were not clear as to their opinions. Living both North and South as they did, they divided their sympathies. Samuel Clemens was thoughtful and far from bloodthirsty. A pilot-house so fine and showy in times of peace seemed a poor place to be in when fighting was going on. He would consider the matter. "I am not anxious to get up into a glass perch and be shot at by either side," he said. "I'll go home and reflect." He went up the river as a passenger on a steamer named the Uncle Sam. Zeb Leavenworth, formerly of the John J. Roe, was one of the pilots, and Clemens usually stood the watch with him. At Memphis they barely escaped the blockade. At Cairo they saw soldiers drilling, troops later commanded by Grant. The Uncle Sam came steaming up to St. Louis, glad to have slipped through safely. They were not quite through, however. Abreast of Jefferson Barracks they heard the boom of a cannon, and a great ring of smoke drifted in their direction. They did not recognize it as a thunderous halt, and kept on. Less than a minute later a shell exploded directly in front of the pilot-house, breaking a lot of glass and damaging the decoration. Zeb Leavenworth tumbled into a corner. "Gee mighty, Sam!" he said. "What do they mean by that?" Clemens stepped from the visitor's bench to the wheel and brought the boat around. "I guess they want us to wait a minute, Zeb," he said. They were examined and passed. It was the last steamboat to make the trip through from New Orleans to St. Louis. Mark Twain's pilot days were over. He would have grieved had he known this fact. "I loved the profession far better than any I have followed since," he long afterward declared, "and I took a measureless pride in it." At the time, like many others, he expected the war to be brief, and his life to be only temporarily interrupted. Within a year, certainly, he would be back in the pilot-house. Meantime, the war must be settled. He would go up to Hannibal and see about it. End of chapter 17. This is The Boy's Life of Mark Twain, chapter 18. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. The Boy's Life of Mark Twain, by Albert Bigelow Paine, Chapter 18, The Soldier. When he reached Hannibal, Samuel Clemens found a very mixed condition of affairs. The country was in an uproar of war preparation. In a border state there was a confusion of sympathies, with much ignorance as to what it was all about. Any number of young men were eager to enlist for a brief camping-out expedition, and small private companies were formed, composed about half and half of Union and Confederate men, as it turned out later. Missouri, meantime, had allied herself with the South, and Samuel Clemens, on his arrival in Hannibal, decided that, like Lee, he would go with his state. Old friends who were getting up a company to help Governor Clabe Jackson repel the invader offered him a lieutenancy if he would join. It was not a big company. It had only about a dozen members, most of whom had been schoolmates, some of them fellow pilots, and Sam Clemens was needed to make it complete. It was just another Tom Sawyer band, and they met in a secret place above Bear Creek Hill and planned how they would sell their lives on the field of glory, just as years before fierce raids had been arranged on peach orchards and melon patches. Secrecy was necessary, for the Union militia had a habit of coming over from Illinois and arresting suspicious armies on sight. It would humiliate the finest army in the world to spend a night or two in the calaboose. So they met secretly at night, and one mysterious evening they called on girls who either were their sweethearts or were pretending to be for the occasion, and when the time came for good-bye, the girls were invited to walk through the pickets with them, though the girls didn't notice any pickets, because the pickets were calling on their girls too, and were a little late getting to their posts. That night they marched, through brush and vines, because the high road was thought to be dangerous, and next morning arrived at the home of Colonel Ralls of Ralls County, who had the army form in dress parade and made it a speech and gave it a hot breakfast in good Southern style. Then he sent out to Colonel Bill Splawn and Farmer Nuck Madsen a requisition for supplies that would convert this body of infantry into cavalry, rough riders of that early day. The community did not wish to keep an army on its hands, and were willing to send it along by such means as they could spare handily. When the outfitting was complete, Lieutenant Samuel Clemens, mounted on a small yellow mule whose tail had been trimmed in the paint-brush pattern then much worn by mules, and surrounded by variously attached articles, such as an extra pair of cowhide boots, a pair of gray blankets, a homemade quilt, a frying-pan, a carpet-sack, a small valise, an overcoat, an old-fashioned Kentucky rifle, 20 yards of rope, and an umbrella, was a fair sample of the brigade. An army like that, to enjoy itself, ought to go into camp. So it went over to Salt River, near the town of Florida, and took up headquarters in a big log stable. Somebody suggested that an army ought to have its hair cut, so that in a hand-to-hand conflict the enemy could not get hold of it. There was a pair of sheep shears in the stable, and Private Tom Lyons acted as barber. They were not sharp shears, and a group of little darkies gathered from the farm to enjoy the torture. Regular elections were now held, all officers down to sergeants and orderlies being officially chosen. There were only 3 privates, and you couldn't tell them from officers. The discipline in that army was very bad. It became worse soon. Pouring rain set in. Salt River rose and overflowed the bottoms. Men ordered on picket duty climbed up into the stable loft and went to bed. Twice, on black, drenching nights, word came from the farmhouse that the enemy, commanded by a certain Colonel Ulysses Grant, was in the neighborhood, and the Hannibal division went hastily, slopping through mud and brush, in the other direction, dragging wearily back when the alarm was over. Military ardor was bound to cool under such treatment. Then Lieutenant Clemens developed a very severe boil, and was obliged to lie most of the day on some hay in a horse trough, where he spent his time denouncing the war and the mistaken souls who had invented it. When word that General Tom Harris, commander of the district, formerly telegraph operator in Hannibal, was at a nearby farmhouse, living on the fat of the land, the army broke camp without further ceremony. Halfway there they met General Harris, who ordered them back to quarters. They called him familiarly Tom, and told him they were through with that camp forever. He begged them, but it was no use. A little farther on they stopped at a farmhouse for supplies. A tall, bony woman came to the door.
"You're Seckish, ain't you?"
Lieutenant Clemens said, "We are, madam, defenders of the noble cause, and we should like to buy a few provisions." The request seemed to inflate her.
"Provisions!" she screamed. "Provisions for Seckish! And my husband a colonel in the Union Army! You get out of here!"
She reached for a hickory hoop-pole. Footnote number 5. In an earlier day, barrel hoops were made of small hickory trees, split and shaved. The hoop-pole was a very familiar article of commerce and of household defense. End of footnote number 5. She reached for a hickory hoop-pole that stood by the door, and the army moved on. When they reached the home of Colonel Bill Splawn, it was night, and the family had gone to bed, so the hungry army camped in the barnyard and crept into the hayloft to sleep. Presently somebody yelled, "Fire!" One of the boys had been smoking and had ignited the hay. Lieutenant Clemens, suddenly awakened, made a quick rotary movement away from the blaze and rolled out of the big hay window into the barnyard below. The rest of the brigade seized the burning hay and pitched it out of the same window. The lieutenant had sprained his ankle when he struck, and his boil was still painful, but the burning hay cured him for the moment. He made a spring from under it, then, noticing that the rest of the army, now that the fire was out, seemed to think his performance amusing, he rose up and expressed himself concerning the war, and military life, and the human race in general. They helped him in then, for his ankle was swelling badly. In the morning Colonel Splawn gave the army a good breakfast, and it moved on. Lieutenant Clemens, however, did not get farther than Farmer Nuck Matson's. He was in a high fever by that time from his injured ankle, and Mrs. Matson put him to bed. So the army left him and presently disbanded. Some enlisted in the regular service, North or South, according to preference. Properly officered and disciplined, that Tom Sawyer band would have made as good soldiers as any. Lieutenant Clemens did not enlist again. When he was able to walk, he went to visit Orion in Keokuk. Orion was a Union abolitionist, but there would be no unpleasantness on that account. Samuel Clemens was beginning to have leanings in that direction himself. End of chapter 18. This is chapter 19 of The Boy's Life of Mark Twain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. The Boy's Life of Mark Twain by Albert Bigelow Paine. Chapter 19, The Pioneer. He arrived in Keokuk at what seemed a lucky moment. Through Edward Bates, a member of Lincoln's cabinet, Orion Clemens had received an appointment as Territorial Secretary of Nevada, and only needed the money to carry him to the seat of his office at Carson City. Out of his pilot's salary, his brother had saved more than enough for the journey, and was willing to pay both their fares and go along as private secretary to Orion, whose position promised something in the way of adventure and a possible opportunity for making a fortune. The brothers went at once to St. Louis for final leave-taking, and there took boat for St. Joe, Missouri, terminus of the great overland stage route. They paid $150 each for their passage, and about the end of July 1861 set out on that long, delightful trip behind 16 galloping horses, never stopping except for meals or to change teams, heading steadily into the sunset over the billowy plains and snow-clad Rockies, covering the 1,700 miles between St. Joe and Carson City in 19 glorious days. But one must read Mark Twain's Roughing It for the story of that long-ago trip, the joy and wonder of it, and the inspiration. "Even at this day," he writes, "it thrills me through and through to think of the life, the gladness, and the wild sense of freedom that used to make the blood dance in my face on those fine overland mornings." It was a hot, dusty August day when they arrived, dusty, unshaven, and weather-beaten, and Samuel Clemens' life as a frontiersman began. Carson City, the capital of Nevada, was a wooden town with an assorted population of 2,000 souls. The mining excitement was at its height, and had brought together the drift of every race. The Clemens brothers took up lodgings with a genial Irishwoman, the Mrs. O'Flanagan of Roughing It, and Orion established himself in a modest office, for there was no Capitol building as yet, no government headquarters. Orion could do all the work, and Samuel Clemens, finding neither duties nor salary attached to his position, gave himself up to the study of the life about him, and to the enjoyment of the freedom of the frontier. Presently he had a following of friends who loved his quaint manner of speech and his yarns. On cool nights they would collect about Orion's office stove, and he would tell stories in the wonderful way that one day would delight the world. Within a brief time Sam Clemens, he was always Sam to the pioneers, was the most notable figure on the Carson streets. His great bushy head of auburn hair, his piercing, twinkling eyes, his loose, lounging walk, his careless disorder of dress invited a second look, even from strangers. From a river dandy he had become the roughest clad of pioneers, rusty slouch hat, flannel shirt, coarse trousers slopping half in and half out of heavy cowhide boots. This was his make-up. Energetic citizens did not prophesy success for him. Often they saw him leaning against an awning support, staring drowsily at the motley human procession, for as much as an hour at a time. Certainly that could not be profitable. But they did like to hear him talk. He did not catch the mining fever at once. He was interested first in the riches that he could see. Among these was the timberland around Lake Bigler, now Tahoe, splendid acres to be had for the asking. The lake itself was beautifully situated. With an Ohio boy, John Kinney, he made an excursion afoot to Tahoe, a trip described in one of the best chapters of Roughing It. They staked out a timber claim and pretended to fence it and to build a house, but their chief employment was loafing in the quiet luxury of the great woods, or drifting in a boat on the transparent water. They did not sleep in the house. In Roughing It he says, "It never occurred to us, for one thing, and besides, it was built to hold the ground, and that was enough. We did not wish to strain it." They made their campfires on the borders of the lake, and one evening it got away from them, fired the forest, and destroyed their fences and habitation. In a letter home he describes this fire in a fine, vivid way. At one place he says, "The level ranks of flame were relieved at intervals by the standard-bearers, as we called the tall dead trees, wrapped in fire, and waving their blazing banners 100 feet in the air. Then we could turn from the scene to the lake and see every branch and leaf and cataract of flame upon its banks perfectly reflected, as in a gleaming, fiery mirror." He was acquiring the literary vision and touch. The description of this same fire in Roughing It, written 10 years later, is scarcely more vivid. Most of his letters home at this time tell of glowing prospects, the certainty of fortune ahead. The fever of the frontier is in them. Once, to Pamela Moffett, he wrote, "Orion and I have enough confidence in this country to think that, if the war lets us alone, we can make Mr. Moffett rich without its ever costing him a cent or a particle of trouble." From the same letter we gather that the brothers are now somewhat interested in mining claims. "We have about 1,650 feet of mining ground, and if it proves good, Mr. Moffett's name will go in, and if not, I can get feet for him in the spring." This was written about the end of October. 2 months later, in midwinter, the mining fever came upon him with full force. End of chapter 19. This is chapter 20 of The Boy's Life of Mark Twain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. The Boy's Life of Mark Twain by Albert Bigelow Paine, Chapter 20, The Miner. The wonder is that Samuel Clemens, always speculative and visionary, had not fallen an earlier victim. Everywhere one heard stories of sudden fortune, of men who had gone to bed paupers and awakened millionaires. New and fabulous finds were reported daily. Cartloads of bricks, silver and gold bricks, drove through the Carson streets. Then suddenly from the newly opened Humboldt region came the wildest reports. The mountains there were said to be stuffed with gold. A correspondent of the Territorial Enterprise was unable to find words to picture the riches of the Humboldt mines. The air for Samuel Clemens began to shimmer. Fortune was waiting to be gathered in a basket. He joined the first expedition for Humboldt, in fact, helped to organize it. In Roughing It, he says, "Hurry was the word. We wasted no time. Our party consisted of 4 persons, a blacksmith 60 years of age, 2 young lawyers, and myself. We bought a wagon and 2 miserable old horses. We put 1,800 pounds of provisions and mining tools in the wagon, and drove out of Carson on a chilly December afternoon." The 2 young lawyers were W. H. Clagett, whom Clemens had known in Keokuk, and A. W. Oliver, called Oliphant in Roughing It. The blacksmith was named Tillou, Ballou in Roughing It, a sturdy, honest man with a knowledge of mining and the repair of tools. There were also 2 dogs in the party, a curly-tailed mongrel and a young hound. The horses were the weak feature of the expedition. It was 200 miles to Humboldt, mostly across sand. The miners rode only a little way, then got out to lighten the load. Later they pushed. Then it began to snow, also to blow, and the air became filled with whirling clouds of snow and sand. On and on they pushed and groaned, sustained by the knowledge that they must arrive sometime when right away they would be millionaires and all their troubles would be over. The nights were better. The wind went down, and they made a campfire in the shelter of the wagon, cooked their bacon, crept under blankets with the dogs to warm them, and Sam Clemens spun yarns till they fell asleep. There had been an Indian war, and occasionally they passed the charred ruin of a cabin and new graves. By and by they came to that deadly waste known as the Alkali Desert, strewn with the carcasses of dead beasts and with the heavy articles discarded by immigrants in their eagerness to reach water. All day and night they pushed through that choking, waterless plain to reach camp on the other side. When they arrived at 3 in the morning, they dropped down exhausted. Judge Oliver, the last survivor of the party, in a letter to the writer of these chapters, said, "The sun was high in the heavens when we were roused from our sleep by a yelling band of Paiute warriors. We were upon our feet in an instant. The picture of burning cabins and the lonely graves we had passed was in our minds. Our scalps were still our own, and not dangling from the belts of our visitors. Sam pulled himself together, put his hand on his head, as if to make sure he had not been scalped, and, with his inimitable drawl, said, 'Boys, they have left us our scalps. Let us give them all the flour and sugar they ask for.' And we did give them a good supply, for we were grateful. The Indians left them unharmed, and the prospective millionaires moved on. Across that 200 miles to the Humboldt country they pushed, arriving at the little camp of Unionville at the end of 11 weary days. In Roughing It, Mark Twain has told us of Unionville and the mining experience there. Their cabin was a 3-sided affair with a cotton roof. Stones rolled down the mountain side on them. Also, the author says, a mule and a cow. The author could not gather fortune in a basket, as he had dreamed. Masses of gold and silver were not lying about. He gathered a backload of yellow, glittering specimens, but they proved worthless. Gold in the rough did not glitter, and was not yellow. Tillou instructed the others in prospecting, and they went to work with pick and shovel, then with drill and blasting powder. The prospect of immediately becoming millionaires vanished. 1 week of this satisfied me. I resigned, is Mark Twain's brief comment. The Humboldt reports had been exaggerated. The Clemens-Clagett-Oliver-Tillou millionaire combination soon surrendered its claims. Clemens and Tillou set out for Carson City with a Prussian named Pfersdorf, who nearly got them drowned and got them completely lost in the snow before they arrived there. Oliver and Clagett remained in Unionville, began law practice, and were elected to office. It is not known what became of the wagon and horses and the 2 dogs. It was the end of January when our miner returned to Carson. He was not discouraged, far from it. He believed he had learned something that would be useful to him in a camp where mines were a reality. Within a few weeks from his return we find him at Aurora, in the Esmeralda region, on the edge of California. It was here that the Clemens brothers owned the 1,650 feet formerly mentioned. He had come down to work it. It was the dead of winter, but he was full of enthusiasm, confident of a fortune by early summer. To Pamela he wrote, "I expect to return to St. Louis in July per steamer. I don't say that I will return then, or that I shall be able to do it, but I expect to, you bet. If nothing goes wrong, we'll strike the ledge in June." He was trying to be conservative, and further along he cautions his sister not to get excited. "Don't you know I have only talked as yet, but proved nothing? Don't you know I have never held in my hands a gold or silver bar that belonged to me? Don't you know that people who always feel jolly no matter where they are or what happens to them, who have the organ of hope preposterously developed, who are endowed with an uncongealable sanguine temperament, who never feel concerned about the price of corn, and who cannot, by any possibility, discover any but the bright side of a picture, are very apt to go to extremes and exaggerate with a 40-horse microscopic power? But, in the bright lexicon of youth there is no such word as fail, and I'll prove it. whereupon he soars again, adding page after page full of glowing expectations and plans such as belong only with speculation in treasures buried in the ground, a very difficult place indeed to find them. His money was about exhausted by this time, and funds to work the mining claims must come out of Orion's rather modest salary. The brothers owned all claims in partnership, and it was now the part of Brother Sam to do the active work. He hated the hard picking and prying and blasting into the flinty ledges, but the fever drove him on. He camped with a young man named Phillips at first, and later on with an experienced miner, Calvin H. Higbie, to whom Roughing It would one day be dedicated. They lived in a tiny cabin with a cotton roof, and around their rusty stove they would paw over their specimens and figure the fortune that their mines would be worth in the spring. Food ran low. Money gave out almost entirely. But they did not give up. When it was stormy and they could not dig, and the ex-pilot was in a talkative vein, he would sit astride the bunk and distribute to his hearers riches more valuable than any they would dig from the Esmeralda hills. At other times he did not talk at all, but sat in a corner and wrote. They thought he was writing home. They did not know that he was literary. Some of his home letters had found their way into a Keokuk paper and had come back to Orion, who had shown them to an assistant on the Territorial Enterprise of Virginia City. The Enterprise man had caused one of them to be reprinted, and this had encouraged its author to send something to the paper direct. He signed these contributions Josh, and one told of an old horse whose name was Methusalem, took him down and sold him in Jerusalem a long time ago. He received no pay for these offerings, and expected none. He considered them of no value. If any one had told him that he was knocking at the door of the house of fame, however feebly, he would have doubted that person's judgment or sincerity. His letters to Orion in Carson City were hasty compositions, reporting progress in progress, or calling for remittances to keep the work going. On April 13 he wrote, "Work not begun on the Horatio and Derby. Haven't seen it yet. It is still in the snow. Shall begin on it within 3 or 4 weeks. Strike the ledge in July." Again later in the month, "I have been at work all day, blasting and digging in one of our new claims, Dashaway, which I don't think a great deal of, but which I am willing to try. We are down now 10 or 12 feet." It must have been disheartening work, picking away at the flinty ledges. There is no further mention of the Dashaway, but we hear of the Flyaway, the Annipolitan, the Live Yankee, and of many another, each of which holds out a beacon of hope for a brief moment, then passes from notice forever. Still, he was not discouraged. Once he wrote, "I am a citizen here, and I am satisfied, though Ratio and I are strapped and we haven't 3 days' rations in the house. I shall work the Monitor and the other claims with my own hands. The pick and shovel are the only claims I have confidence in now," he wrote later. "My back is sore and my hands are blistered with handling them today." His letters began to take on a weary tone. Once in midsummer he wrote that it was still snowing up there in the hills, and added, "It always snows here, I expect. If we strike it rich, I've lost my guess, that's all." And the final heartsick line, "Don't you suppose they have pretty much quit writing at home?" In time he went to work in a quartz mill at $10 a week, though it was not entirely for the money, as in Roughing It he would have us believe. Samuel Clemens learned thoroughly what he undertook, and he proposed to master the science of mining. From Phillips and Higbie he had learned what there was to know about prospecting. He went on to the mill to learn refining, so that when his claims developed he could establish a mill and personally superintend the work. His stay was brief. He contracted a severe cold and came near getting poisoned by the chemicals. Recovering, he went with Higbie for an outing to Mono Lake, a ghastly, lifeless, alkali sea among the hills, vividly described in Roughing It. At another time he went with Higbie on a walking trip to the Yosemite, where they camped and fished undisturbed, for in those days few human beings came to that far isolation. Discouragement did not reach them there. Amid that vast grandeur and quiet, the quest for gold hardly seemed worth while. Now and again that summer he went alone into the wilderness to find his balance and to get entirely away from humankind. In Roughing It, Mark Twain tells the story of how he and Higbie finally located a blind lead, which made them really millionaires until they forfeited their claim through the sharp practice of some rival miners and their own neglect. It is true that the Wide West claim was forfeited in some such manner, but the size of the loss was magnified in Roughing It to make a good story. There was never a fortune in Wide West except the one sunk in it by its final owners. The story as told in Roughing It is a tale of what might have happened, and ends the author's days in the mines with a good storybook touch. The mining career of Samuel Clemens really came to a close gradually, and with no showy climax. He fought hard and surrendered little by little, without owning, even to the end, that he was surrendering at all. It was the gift of resolution that all his life would make his defeats long and costly, his victories supreme. By the end of July the money situation in the Aurora camp was getting desperate. Orion's depleted salary would no longer pay for food, tools, and blasting powder, and the miner began to cast about for means to earn an additional sum, however small. The Josh letters to the Enterprise had awakened interest as to their author, and Orion had not failed to let Josh's identity be known. The result had been that here and there a coast paper had invited contributions and even suggested payment. A letter written by the Aurora miner at the end of July tells this part of the story. "My debts are greater than I thought for. The fact is, I must have something to do, and that shortly, too. Now write to the Sacramento Union folks, or to Marsh, and tell them that I will write as many letters a week as they want, for $10 a week. My board must be paid. Tell them I have corresponded with the New Orleans Crescent and other papers and the Enterprise. If they want letters from here, who'll run from morning till night collecting material cheaper? I'll write a short letter twice a week, for the present, for the Age, for $5 per week. Now it has been a long time since I couldn't make my own living, and it shall be a long time before I loaf another year." This all led to nothing. But about the same time the Enterprise assistant already mentioned spoke to Joseph T. Goodman, owner and editor of the paper, about adding Josh to their regular staff. Joe Goodman, a man of keen humor and literary perception, agreed that the author of the Josh letters might be useful to them. One of the sketches particularly appealed to him, a burlesque report of a Fourth of July oration. "That is the kind of thing we want," he said. "Write to him, Barstow, and ask him if he wants to come up here." Barstow wrote, offering $25 a week, a tempting sum. This was at the end of July, 1862. Yet the hard-pressed miner made no haste to accept the offer. To leave Aurora meant the surrender of all hope in the mines, the confession of another failure. He wrote Barstow, asking when he thought he might be needed, and at the same time, in a letter to Orion, he said, "I shall leave at midnight tonight, alone and on foot, for a walk of 60 or 70 miles through a totally uninhabited country. But do you write Barstow that I have left here for a week or so, and in case he should want me, he must write me here, or let me know through you." He had gone into the wilderness to fight out his battle alone, postponing the final moment of surrender that, had he known, only meant the beginning of victory. He was still undecided when he returned 8 days later and wrote to his sister Pamela a letter in which there is no mention of newspaper prospects. Just how and when the end came at last cannot be known, but one hot, dusty August afternoon in Virginia City, a worn, travel-stained pilgrim dragged himself into the office of the Territorial Enterprise, then in its new building on C Street, and, loosening a heavy roll of blankets from his shoulder, dropped wearily into a chair. He wore a rusty slouch hat, no coat, a faded blue flannel shirt, a navy revolver. His trousers were tucked into his boot-tops. A tangle of reddish-brown hair fell on his shoulders. A mass of tawny beard, dingy with alkali dust, dropped halfway to his waist. Aurora lay 130 miles from Virginia City. He had walked that distance, carrying his heavy load. Editor Goodman was absent at the moment, but the other proprietor, Dennis E. McCarthy, asked the caller to state his errand. The wanderer regarded him with a far-away look and said absently and with deliberation, "My starboard leg seems to be unshipped. I'd like about 100 yards of line. I think I'm falling to pieces." Then he added, "I want to see Mr. Barstow or Mr. Goodman. My name is Clemens, and I've come to write for the paper." It was the master of the world's widest estate, come to claim his kingdom. End of chapter 20.